Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. I'm your host, Mike Allen. The New Haven Town Green, it's 16 acres in size. It was built way back in 1638, and it was laid out in 9 equal grids. Now, those contours mark the oldest continuously used land grid in North America, older even than Montreal. Well, the green has seen its share of history on its turf, and it's made history of its own, and it turns out it has a lot of secrets to share. Well, our guest today is going to share some of those secrets. Jason Bischoff-Wursel. He's the director of photo archives at the New Haven Museum. And like most of us who have ever walked the town green in New Haven, he's a huge admirer of what it stands for and how it brings people together. Jason will be along in just a moment. This week's trivia question: he currently produces this country's most popular word puzzle. Who is he, and what's the puzzle? Stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you'll know the topic for next week's show. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is brought to you by our sponsor, Yale New Haven Health. When people need the best quality health care, there's a reason they turn to Yale New Haven Health. In 1826, Yale New Haven Hospital became Connecticut's very first hospital. They were the first hospital in the U.S. to use chemotherapy. Yale New Haven was the first to introduce insulin pumps for diabetic patients, and they introduced the world's first intensive care unit for newborns. For more information about Yale New Haven Health, visit ynhhs.org. That's ynhhs.org. It is this nation's oldest continuously used grid of land for residents of a municipality to gather on their common ground. In other words, it's the country's oldest official town green. Yes, there are other towns in New England, technically, that established a central town green before New Haven did in 1638. Not a lot, but a few. But they didn't lay it out with as much forethought and purpose, and they certainly haven't maintained it continuously in the traditional colonial sense like the Elm City of New Haven has done. And it turns out there are some hidden secrets in that 16-acre parcel, smack in the center of the oldest part of downtown New Haven, one of the first colonies in the state of Connecticut. Well, just wait until you hear about some of those secrets from today's guest, Jason Bischoff-Wursel. He's the director of photo archives for the New Haven Museum. He's also a seasoned historian on New Haven and its surrounding areas, and he's a frequent visitor to the New Haven Green. Jason, the first question I want to ask you about the New Haven Green, because I've read what I can about it and why it was set up the way it was. Was it just as simple as we're going to make it square? I've read some places that the 9 segments were put in there, and one of them to accommodate the 144,000 believers who were going to go to heaven. Is any truth to that old rumor?
There's like a lot of different takes on it. Basically, from a belief standpoint, so New Haven was founded by a very strong belief group of Puritanism. They'd left England and they'd gone to Boston and then broken off to form their own colony. So this was a group that was very devoted. It was 500 people, and they came to New Haven and created a treaty with the local native residents, the Quinnipiac tribe at the time, and acquired some of this land. So yes, they were very devout in their beliefs. So there's always this discussion like, oh, the 9 squares, they were set up just so, and it matches the way the sun moves and what have you. I think a lot of that's coincidence. And there may have been this idea that the entire 9 squares, which still continuously is what we know is downtown, the entire 9 squares of New Haven, if you walked them, and you can easily do that, that is still pretty much the same almost exact border as this original grid, which is pretty cool. So yes, I think within the entire 9 squares, yes, it would have held potentially the 144,000. You're basically settling into an area that's completely, kind of wild. I mean, frontier to some degree. There was native kind of trails through the area, but that had been severely diminished due to wars with other tribes, disease, and kind of encroaching activity from the Dutch coming up from New Amsterdam, which is now known as New York. When you're developing this area, basically in this wild kind of frontier on the other side of the world, it's kind of best to set up like a fort. So the 9 squares allowed you to actually build kind of fortress walls around it. And given they would just be sort of wood stock, what have you, it was a better way to kind of protect the population. And then at the center is the meeting area, and it's the meeting place. And again, that goes back to this idea of what were town greens traditionally. It's where you actually literally have a green area that's common. It's common lands. It's a field. And so animals were there. People kept their animals. You would sell things. You'd gather for church. You'd gather basically for all purposes on this common land.
Now, there are 3 churches on the New Haven Green, and 2 of them tended to lean Puritan, and one was more the British sort of version, the Episcopal Church. Was there any rhyme or reason as to, settlers who favored Britain and settlers who favored a different version of religion?
Yeah, I mean, all 3 churches kind of give different indications of the course of New Haven's history. Center Church dates back to pretty much the founding, and United was a break from that. And then Trinity, then again, is kind of this, breaking away from just strict Puritan belief structure and government to allowing other religions.
So now let's answer one question that a lot of people wonder about. They hear about this cemetery that's in the basement of one of those 3 churches. Can you just tell us that whole story, how that happened?
Yeah, so it's actually pretty interesting because there is a crypt under Center Church. So Center Church has been more or less in operation since the founding of the colony. And this is the center of the colony at that point. And so also keep in mind, when I say colony, New Haven colony, that generally means the boundaries of New Haven County today. So areas like Brantford, Guilford, Woodbridge, Bethany, they were all part of this colony. And when I say colony, that also means that this was technically not part of Connecticut. It was within what we consider Connecticut, obviously, but it was its own independent colony. So here's the center of all that activity. And the church is the center of all life. The New Haven colony was established not just as a strong practice in Puritan belief systems and what have you, but also commerce. There's money that has to be established, and to establish a colony, and then money has to be made to pay back your debts and actually become solvent. So you have this center area there where all this activity happens, and at that point, you had a graveyard. In New Haven in particular, we have the Grove Street Cemetery. Grove Street is recognized as one of the first planned cemeteries in the United States. Just after the American Revolution, early 1800s, this idea of actually constructing cemeteries and the idea of what they would be, kind of that we're used to, this idea of gravestones, and you walk through and there's like these nice manicured streets, if you will, like these little avenues. There was an intention prior to that, and this is what you'll see throughout Connecticut. You see them everywhere, actually, in Connecticut, and you don't really realize it. You see these little tiny cemeteries and these little tiny grave sites everywhere, because prior to this idea, people just kind of buried their family. Say you have a backyard or you have a farm, then you definitely would have like a family cemetery on that farm. So in a city environment, people didn't have this common area, so they would bury people on the common lands, often without markers. So that's why in New Haven Green today, and the numbers vary, but I like to basically say, and I've talked to leading state archaeologists and whatnot, and the estimate can go as high as 17,000 people currently still buried in the green. The evidence that we see of this, though, is only in this crypt under Center Church. The reason the crypt is there is because Center Church was actually built, the version that is there today was built above the remainder of the cemetery. So those are the last remaining headstones. When you go down into the crypt, that area was actually the level area of the green at that point. So it's actually elevated above, which creates that sense of going, underneath the building into a crypt.
I'm amazed because when you think the green was established, give or take a year, at 1640, and the old Yale campus didn't come around for roughly another century, I think, and it's right next door. I would have thought somebody else would have gobbled up that land right next to the green, but Yale got it. Did they have to displace people to get in there?
The thing about the breakdown of land, kind of fortifications, but it was also this class system right from the get-go. And New Haven was particularly interesting because a lot of the initial settlers were merchants. They were people of, what you'd consider upper class. So they came here with means. So that meant, depending on your investment in the colony, which, basically was a company, you got the choice placement of your land and closer to the green. So that's how it's kind of set up, and it's set up in a radial fashion. So further away from the green on the 9 squares, you might be kind of lower down. And then actually outside of these 9 squares, there were established, quote, suburbs at that point. So what we consider the beginning of the neighborhood of the Hill in New Haven, that was established at the same time. And that was known as the suburb. And that was where basically the servants and the people who worked on the ships and what have you, they lived there. So already it kind of set up this, segregated system. Yeah, if you were on the green, traditionally that's the town leaders, which generally were men of economic stature. So by the time Yale coming to New Haven, because it had been founded in Old Saybrook, it was within those circles of both town leadership and tradition, which then also helped to solidify New Haven from kind of this struggling backwater town to, essentially having a legacy that lasts to today.
Now, I know there have been some presidents that have come through New Haven, obviously, over the years and have been on the green. And what about Abe Lincoln?
He actually did a few blocks over at Union Hall, which has long since been torn down on Union Street. The speech there predated his New York speech, his famous New York speech that basically kind of put him on the political map. But it was within that tour. It was one of those tour where he solidified he became the front runner, so to speak. But yes, he was there and he was staying in New Haven. Other presidents, presidential candidates, what have you. I mean, you have George Washington, obviously, has been to the green, both during the Revolution and post-Revolution. Bill Clinton, as in recent years, as a Yale student and later as a president. The Bush family actually grew up in New Haven and attended Yale. So you have that kind of lineage here. The green has been adjacent to other events in history, such as the first patent being established for the bicycle, as Pierre Lalemant rode his velocipede around the green, and people were like, what is this thing? This incredible iron horse this man is riding, as he wanted to place the patent for what would become, the modern bicycle.
I also understand that there's some, what I would characterize as unusual ownership of the land. It's not the city of New Haven, is it?
Technically, no. Technically, the proprietors, I believe it's the common lands of New Haven. A few years ago, there was this thing, people were like, I never knew that, the green isn't owned by New Haven. It's this shadowy group of proprietors, and who are they? And it's really not that nefarious at all. It is kind of, mildly complicated, but not really when you stop and think about it. What it actually is the New Haven Green is, this completely active living, you can't even say relic, it's an active living display of history. The proprietors are similar to that as well. The proprietors, so in their title, it's common lands. So that dates back to the idea of this marketplace, this center area. And that's the thing, too. The New Haven Green was never really called the New Haven Green officially until about the 1880s or so. It was always referred to as the marketplace, the ancient grounds. So really just it became codified as the green. So that said, this idea of common grounds, though, and common lands is really kind of important. And it wasn't just here, it was take any city really of the colonial era. So what that means is, as I mentioned before, you have this kind of class system, right? And you have people that not only get the larger tracts, they have kind of like larger houses. There's a certain, basically a percentage of land that you're allotted. And kind of due to like basically what would be your stock in the company. You also have outside of this colonized area, which is really just the 9 squares, which is our downtown today, in the surrounding areas that would be kind of forests, rivers, etc. That area, even though it's not being lived on and actively used, was still part of the colony. So they would split up these lands, and in some cases they were these common lands because commonly the residents needed things like wood for not just building your house, but for heat. So it was a resource that was held. So the proprietors date back to that sense of managing the common lands. It was continuously in place from the original settlement charters and kind of established that your role with the proprietors would be inherited. And that was changed in the early 1800s, where you'd be nominated. And when you're nominated, it's kind of like the Supreme Court in the sense that you're nominated for life. When you become a proprietor, people can retire when they feel like it's similar to the Supreme Court.
So when Superstorm Sandy came by, what happened during that storm?
So during Superstorm Sandy, trees fell over, what have you. There was a lot of damage in the area, and the Lincoln oak fell over and was lost. And the Lincoln oak, at that point, had kind of been sort of forgotten. It was a large tree on the upper green. When it fell over, and its root system were a bunch of skeletons that rose with it. And I want to say this was on Halloween, or it was Halloween weekend. They got in the news for several reasons. These skeletons popping out of the New Haven Green around Halloween. It was planted by the Grand Army of the Republic on an anniversary of, I believe it was the 50th anniversary of the end of the Civil War. The Grand Army of the Republic was a post-Civil War kind of veteran service that existed to the very last veteran survivor of the Civil War, and then was designed to end. So that's why if we see, Grand Army of the Republic highways and what have you all around, that was the organization. So anyhow, they were connected to this Lincoln oak, and when it fell, skeletons came out, were excavated, and there's clearly different kind of scientific tests and what have you done to confirm their identities, or the theory of their identities. Something significant from that, aside from casting the attention to the fact that the people are buried there, is the idea of how people are buried there. And so that's why the estimates, I feel like, are higher. You'll see like lower thousands or slightly higher thousands, because people tended to be buried there, again, unmarked, in layers. So you have potentially 6 to 7 layers of bodies buried. That means people buried just kind of on top of each other as time goes on in the New Haven Green.
Well, that wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. The Lincoln Memorial tree that fell during Superstorm Sandy, exposing all those skeletons from unmarked graves, well, it was originally planted in 1909. It fell in 2012, and a year later, in 2013, a replacement tree was planted right there on the northern part of the green. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Jason Bischoff-Wursel. He's Director of Photo Archives at the New Haven Museum. The answer to this week's trivia question, the question was, he currently produces this country's most popular word puzzle. Who is he, and what is the puzzle? Well, the answer is, if you're a puzzle addict like me, you already know the name David Hoyt. He creates the puzzle Jumble every day for our enjoyment and sometimes frustration. Next week on Amazing Tales CT, we're going to speak to this Connecticut native who's considered the most syndicated puzzle maker in the country. And he's going to take us behind the scenes for a look at the making of puzzles. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.